IVT's Validation Week is going virtual for 2020 this October. Not to be confused with a single presentation webinar or Zoom training, Val Week 2020 brings a completely virtual 3-day conference experience. With nearly 30 expert speakers and a combination of live and on-demand sessions crafted with your time in mind, the caliber of training content is unrivaled. Hear from top pharma, biotech, and medical device subject matter experts, gain exclusive insights from FDA speakers, build up your team's validation toolkit with take-home checklists and materials, and leverage unlimited networking opportunities with colleagues and key decision makers. Plus, claim up to 15 credit hours toward GMP training requirements. You won't want to miss it. Visit www.informaconnect.com/validation week for all details on agenda and registration. Once again, that's www.informaconnect.com/validation-week for all event details.
This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. Each week, we bring you timely interviews with life science experts and discussions focused on trending topics, frequently asked questions, and industry best practices. And this week, we are pleased to welcome Marty Lipa. He is the Executive Director of Knowledge Management with Merck. It's great to have you today, Marty.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
No, absolutely. So today we're going to talk about knowledge management as an asset in pharmaceuticals. And Marty, some might argue that one of the most important assets or products a company has in today's business is their knowledge. Companies tend to lack standardized approaches, though, for managing their internal knowledge and passing it down the line, which leads to working in silos and other inefficiencies in how organizations leverage the best of what it knows collectively as a group to accomplish its mission and be more successful. So effectively managing knowledge is an expectation established in multiple regulatory guidelines that we've heard, and many organizations fail to recognize their knowledge and their expertise as the asset that it really is. And so today we are going to talk about the importance of managing knowledge as an asset in the pharmaceutical industry and learn how every company can begin to capitalize on this very important product. And I know you've done a lot of research in this area. Before we dive in on some of the concepts, I'm hoping you can help define the term knowledge management, which is a term that may seem very familiar to many, yet still is very difficult to define. How do you define knowledge management?
That's great, Stacey. And again, thanks again for having me. I'm very passionate about KM, as you're going to find out during this course of this conversation. So, in the context of the pharmaceutical industry, I'll throw out the most often cited definition, which comes from ICH-Q10, and it's a little bit boring, dare I say, which reads, it's a systematic approach to acquiring, analyzing, storing, and disseminating information regarding to products, manufacturing processes, and components. And while that is certainly accurate, in my opinion, that's a little bit of a narrow definition. And frankly, the other ICH guidelines really, I'll say, almost point out some deficiencies in that definition, and I perhaps I'll talk about that later. But I think practically, I really think about knowledge management as the practice of getting knowledge to flow. And there's definitions by APQC, the American Productivity and Quality Center, and others, which really talk about it's about getting knowledge to flow to the right person at the right time so they can drive a business outcome, whether that be a decision or some other outcome. And it's interesting, if you were to ask all the different disciplines in a given business what their definition of knowledge management was or what they think knowledge management is, If you asked IT versus learning and development, KM seems to be something that has a very biased view based on where you're coming from. And so I think that's one of the fundamental issues, is getting to a more common definition and being able to leverage that to drive the discipline forward.
And certainly that idea of information flow really does simplify it, I guess, in terms of, what exactly it is in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Can you share with us, because we are talking about, knowledge management as an asset in pharmaceuticals. So can you give us an overview of knowledge management in that sense, and a little bit about the history of this as a concept?
Yeah, of course. And so interestingly, knowledge management as a practice. So think about knowledge management. There's tons of management sciences. There's project management and program management, right? So think about it as a management science, or anyways, that's how I think about it. And as things go, knowledge management is a relatively young practice dating back to the early 1990s. So about 30 years, which compared to Lean Six Sigma and the disciplines of learning and development and some of the peers that we run with were relatively young, and there's still a lot of maturing that's going on. I'll also say that when KM first came out, it came out as the internet was really growing, and not just the internet, but the connectivity, the global connectivity, big database systems came out, SharePoint came out, or not specifically came out back then, but the predecessors and over the course of the KM journey, social media as we know it today has evolved in that time frame. And so really all of that allowed for the means for people to connect faster and on a global scale. And KM has matured and evolved with that over time. And different industries are in different places with their KM journey. So for example, some of the leaders in knowledge management you'll find in aerospace, including at NASA and Rockwell Collins and others. Energy, a lot of people in oil and gas in particular are pretty strong in knowledge management. Actually, military, the U.S. government has KM programs in the Navy and the Army, and again, I mentioned NASA and so on, and consulting, because that's their business.
Right.
And so you'll see that all these different firms have these different industries and firms within them have matured KM programs for their respective need and what they're trying to accomplish.
So those other industries, they are a bit ahead of us, but it seems to me, just listening to you talk, that knowledge is hugely important in the pharmaceutical industry. And at the onset today, we mentioned that knowledge management is actually an asset. So what do you mean when you say managing knowledge as an asset?
Yeah, great question. I think so. To start and give that some context, think about the pharmaceutical industry, biopharmaceutical industry. Clearly, in my opinion, anyways, and hopefully this is not in debate, that we're a knowledge-based industry. People and organizations make progress. They develop products. They solve problems. They make improvements. They compete really on their knowledge and their ability to flow and apply that knowledge to that need. Again, and there's I just shared some examples of that. Our work is not purely transactional in what we do, totally repetitive, and therefore people need to think for a living. They need to be adaptive. They need to synthesize. Shouldn't have said that here, but synthesize knowledge to be able to drive to the outcome that they're looking for. And also organizations have invested immense amounts of time and expert, sometimes by highly skilled scientists, to create just masses of knowledge, whether that is in a document, and we might refer to that as explicit knowledge, or whether that's in the experience of an expert, or we might think about that as tacit knowledge or know-how. And those things, as I mentioned earlier, we apply them at the right time in the right context to solve a business problem, like make a decision, set a specification, resolve a problem, release a batch, whatever that might be. And so, yeah. So
yeah, I was going to say, and so, if you are investing this much time and money into knowledge, getting knowledge, creating this information, then it does make sense. Then you would have to treat it as any other asset, right? Or should.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And just if you think about that, just one quick analogy, if you think about physical assets like equipment or financial assets, you're not leaving those on the shelf hoping they're not rusty or that your bank account is leaking, as we might think about leaking knowledge over time. And so that's really the analog that I'd like people to think about is we've invested so much in this, you're going to treat it accordingly by stewarding it and curating it and making sure it's available when and where you need it.
Right. It sounds like that needs to happen. You don't want to leave it to rust on the shelf.
Exactly.
No, you got to take care of it and pay attention. So then we are talking about this in the context of the pharmaceutical industry. What are the benefits of a formal knowledge management program then for companies, in particular in life science organizations?
The great, and I think I probably use this quote too much, but hope is not a strategy. So hoping that you can manage your knowledge is not a strategy. So I think it's twofold, and I think and this really is an opportunity for people to reflect on what they want to do. So the pharmaceutical quality system, ICH Q10, as it lays out knowledge management, is really nominally focused at the pharmaceutical quality system and achieving the three goals of ICH Q10, which are to establish and maintain a state of control, to drive continual improvement and achieve product realization. And knowledge management plays a big role in everything that pharmaceutical quality system is supposed to do. So nominally, being able to link to better PQS outcomes based on what you've done. However, the very fact that knowledge management is a vibrant practice in other disciplines says it's not all about the PQS. Right. And there are plenty of opportunities for business efficiency. And we've also seen some fantastic success stories for employee engagement as well, which can't be underestimated. And so I sometimes describe it, whereas the pharmaceutical quality system angle is sort of why you have to, whereas the business efficiency angle is why we can't afford not to. And we've seen fantastic results in terms of deviation reduction during PPQs. We've avoided some stockouts. We've found equipment at the next building over to then continue a clinical batch release. We've found supplies to prevent problems, and we've seen a huge, massively percentage-wise reduction in technical issues. So there's a whole litany of different benefits that can emerge with a formal program.
Yeah, I mean, it does sound like there's so many benefits to it, well beyond just compliance,
exactly.
or quality systems.
Exactly.
So, I think we in these first couple of minutes have really established how important knowledge management can be, especially in the life sciences industry. So, assuming that we understand the importance of knowledge management to our company's success, then how do we go about adopting a formal program?
So that's another great question. I think like anything else, you need to understand the problem that you want to solve. And this is where getting into understanding the nature of the knowledge problem. I sometimes say there are no knowledge management projects, because there's business projects that require knowledge to flow better, right? We use knowledge management as a means to tackle those. So deciding where to start, what problem to solve, starting with something that will generate some success and build some competency is really important, and then you can scale up over time. And there's many directions to scale, whether it's across the life cycle, across multiple plant sites, across multiple functional areas. But pick a problem where there's a clear problem, a strong sponsor, a cycle time where you can measure your problem in a finite period of time. You don't have to wait 5 years to see the results. Invest in building competency and training people. That's something I wish I had done a little bit more of, is not just assuming people got it, but making sure that they really get it. And then think agile, right? Solve a problem, diagnose, solve, repeat. That kata thinking about what's my next target condition, and moving up that curve is really valuable as well. So you don't want to if you've solved it all at once, you've either thought too small or you've taken too long to get there, is what I would say.
Sure. So it sounds like knowledge management really needs to be the backbone of all that you're doing, really. And it almost sounds to me like it's more of a culture or a mindset shift rather than a formal program. But I mean, still, you need to kind of write these things down, plan it out for yourself. So what makes up a good knowledge management program then?
I think tying your the most important thing, as I alluded to, saying there are no knowledge management projects, if you will,
Right.
figuratively speaking, is that what you're trying to do is tied to the business outcome you're trying to achieve. So understanding that very clearly. Because knowledge management is somewhat ambiguous to people, we've really enjoyed having some really strong sponsorship, and finding somebody who can bring some legitimacy is really important. A few other factors include having people with time to work on it. If it can't be the 10% of time given to somebody, because when you're told take 10% of your time and develop the strategy, you'll never get there. Standardized practices are really important. Standardized knowledge management approaches, like having a model for how to do communities of practice or lessons learned or what have you. Two more things I would probably add to that list are measurement. Know how you want to measure your progress. And lastly, organizational change management, Cotter 8 steps, Connor change execution methodology, whatever your methodology is to be able to drive people change is really important to bring along with you as well, because there is a lot of work to do to get people to think differently, because people are used to working their way, and it's hard to change.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. We're all guilty of that sometimes, right? And some people resist change more than others. So that definitely makes sense. So what factors then do you think need to be in place to create this sort of culture shift? Is it the environment or is it the people? And what influence? It's a two-part question. And what influential factors determine this type of change?
I think it's both the environment and the people, because you need to change the environment to set them up for success, but you need to invest in the people as well. And there's a variety of models out there, and there's one model that I like to refer to, at the DCOM model, which really gets into people act a certain way. As you go into the diagnostics behind that, people act a certain way because of the antecedents, and that drive their behaviors, and the consequences reinforce that. And even just asking questions, if you ask why people do or don't do lessons learned, or even better, seek lessons learned at the beginning of a project,
Sure.
I would suspect you'll hear things like "not invented here," "I can't find them," "I want to figure it out on my own," reward systems that are different, et cetera. So really understanding that people bit and that environment that they're set up in, and how people actually work. And whenever you get a chance, and let me strengthen that, you should always try to tie culture, the desired culture of KM around knowledge sharing and seeking and asking questions for help, to the organization's existing culture and the mission. So if you can make some ties there, that's really important, because it makes knowledge management, or perhaps stated differently, managing knowledge, linked to the success of the organization, and that's a powerful thing.
Right. And if it's part of the overall culture, people are more likely to comply, and you're going to find yourself more successful as an organization, I would think.
Correct.
So in your experience, because you've been through this before, is it advisable for an organization to launch a pilot program, a KM pilot program within their organization before really instituting widespread knowledge management practices or efforts?
I think that's up to the organization. In my opinion, it is, because and I mentioned this in my example earlier, right? Start a problem, start with something, and then prove to yourself that you can do it. You know what the faults are, how your culture is going to react, et cetera, and then scale over time. Going big bang will take a lot longer, and bring a bit more risk in having solved the right problem to the right level of detail. So again, it goes in line with that agile sort of thinking. It builds quick wins, it demonstrates value, it builds confidence. And in a lot of the literature, it talks about how do you describe the value of, say, communities of practice. And one of the, as an example, and one of the best ways there are success stories. And we've had success stories for as much as $10 million where we were able to find a reagent to release a batch when the vendor was having some supply issues, and probably more than that because it preserved market share. And so when you get those success stories and you share them with people, A, it communicates the undisputable value, and B, it helps them envision seeing themselves in that scenario, and it helps drive adoption as well. So that's another reason to be able to start to look for those and harvest those and reinforce where you're going.
Yeah, I mean, $10 million, that's certainly a big win. And I would think that would boost, everyone's confidence in this method.
Yep.
How do, you mentioned just a little while ago, you mentioned measurement as being one of the important factors. How do companies measure their knowledge management programs? And, are there key success factors that they're looking for here when they're doing that?
I think the ultimate measure is, as I alluded to earlier, the real outcome measure is performance of the pharmaceutical quality system in terms of fewer CAPAs or fewer time to less time to resolve them, or other factors like that. Those are really lagging indicators. It's like if you think about the safety pyramid, where you track safety training completion and near misses as leading indicators to the end of the day, a lower injury rate. But you don't; those are looking backwards. Those things have already happened. And so tying, ultimately what I like to do is tie the knowledge management efforts to a particular business process that's hopefully measured. And then if you can improve that performance of that business process, that's how you can tangibly show that you're making some results in a near real-time basis. There are also a variety of other factors. There's a lot in the literature in terms of leading indicators: activity in communities, questions answered, how many answers per question, have you done after action reviews at every milestone. We've done a lot to try to quantify the value of our lessons learned program, which has delivered some substantial value to us. And we basically do that by interviewing a subset of people who have actually had lessons implemented. So again, there's a litany of different approaches. I think one of the secrets is do it enough to keep your sponsors happy. And I say that,
right.
and that sounds funny, but an executive vice president said that to me, and the waves of expectations there, I think, come and go based on what's going on in your company. There are stories about the World Bank and others that stopped measuring because they were wildly successful 10, 12 years ago. New leadership came in and their KM program got wiped out. And so it's important to be thinking, sensing what's around you and linking to your value of what you do and how evident it is.
And quick follow up to that, Marty, because you mentioned tying it to a process that you can measure. Ideally, are you tying it to one process, or are you trying to integrate it with more than one, all of your processes? What's best practice here in your mind?
I think it depends on what you are. It depends on the decisions that you make about what your KM program is trying to do. So for example, at some companies, their KM program is a super comprehensive collection of communities of practice that really connect people together. Some companies, it's really much more about getting access to content. Other companies, it's about a mix of the two, which is what we do, and many other things: lessons learned, knowledge retention, tacit knowledge transfer, and so on. So a great example in our industry would be technology transfer. And how would one then, and technology transfer has sub-processes, but how would we look at tech transfer being done right on time, and the process robustness afterwards, and preventing deviations during PPQ batches? So there's kind of sub-measures there. But technology transfer would be an example of a top-tier process that everyone would recognize that has many facets by which KM could impact it.
Okay, understood. So it seems like obvious that this would be a benefit to pharmaceutical, but yet it's not widespread yet, at least in the life science industries. What do you think the biggest challenges and barriers for companies looking to leverage their knowledge and their know-how? What are they?
I think and in general, and I don't know that we're unique on this, but some of the challenges are really around having standard business processes, and different companies manage those to different levels of robustness. I'll say there's a really good KM I'll say slogan or motto perhaps is manage knowledge in the flow of work. And so, for example, what we mean by that is take an after action review and have that as a milestone in your tech transfer, that's in the flow, because you can't do the work without doing the after action review, because it's a stage gate expectation, as opposed to having a hoping somebody will remember to do one, and they'll be too busy and it probably doesn't happen. So that's an example. So having standard business processes to then embed the knowledge management. Culture is tough because we're changing how people work, and in our industry, we've got a lot of really, really bright people that value their creativity, which is great. But then, how do you create one standard for where you store things? How do you create one standard for what communities look like? Those are all difficult things to do, especially in large multinational organizations. And lastly, I would say just making sure you have the right partnership. So you need the more comprehensive and mature your program is, you'll need partnerships with IT, with Lean Six Sigma organization, with human resources, with learning and development. And so spend time maturing those relationships, because you can't be successful without them. There's a lot of similar things that they do, and I do very much believe that KM fills a niche, but going forward in partnership with them will strengthen you both.
And that's a really great tip, Marty. So I feel like we have really established a nice overview of knowledge management, especially, using it as an asset in the pharmaceutical industry. And hopefully our listeners have really grasped that concept. But Marty, I know that you're continuing to do research on this very important topic. And if you could, where are we headed as an industry? And what's next for you?
No, thanks for that. I'm the curious type, so I'm always doing something.
Yeah.
So I would say there's two distinct areas. So one of the things I've been doing for my day job is really looking at how we accelerate and standardize the transfer of tacit knowledge. And we talk about, and it's really in the ICH guidelines as well. It's in there, even if it's not obvious. It uses the word expertise, experience, have experienced operators in your risk assessments, and so on, as well as there's some decent use of the word know-how, and not just in ICH, but in PICS and UDRLEX, in the WHO guidelines, et cetera. And so really tapping into that, and that's been talked about at conferences for about 10 years now, but there's really not been much there. And so that's one thing that I'm passionate about driving forward with the industry. In particular, I would say the industry as a whole is also managing through the digital transformation and journeys that people are on, and KM certainly plays a role there as well. So there's a lot of change and challenges, but opportunity for us as an industry. On the side, I'm doing some legitimate research on knowledge management, and there's a few topics I've been looking at. And one is, how do we really standardize knowledge transfer across the continuum of tech transfer? So those tech transfer examples I used are very near and dear to my heart.
Right. And
really thinking about a standardized way of planning for knowledge transfer during tech transfer, which is highly neglected in the guidance documents. Methods to have that knowledge flow, and then an assessment to see how well you did, and then an action plan to feed that information back to the next tech transfer, improve the business process, to the development process, or to forward to the control strategy. And there's one more thing I'm very excited about to mention briefly, which is really exploring the link between quality risk management and knowledge management. They're twin enablers of ICH Q10, but they really operate as separate disciplines. And there's clearly a relationship between risk and knowledge. As knowledge goes up, risk goes down. And so I've shared some research actually with IVT there, and more coming on that topic as well.
Excellent. Yes. And so thank you. You have done a couple of articles for us, and we'll share those links to those in the show notes so that our listeners can get caught up a little bit on what you've already done. And we'll certainly look for some updates from you, and perhaps another podcast or two as some of this research comes to fruition. So thank you for that. Before we wrap up today, Marty, I just want to see if you have any advice or tips or anything that you'd like to leave our listeners with.
I think I would just summarize a few of the points that I said before. and really understand the problem that you're trying to solve. It can't be KM for the sake of KM or because someone else had this idea. Really, the more you can tie it to a business problem that people care about, the more successful you're going to be. The more you can measure it, the more tangible the outcome will be. The more energy you'll get from people who you've helped, and so on. So that's probably the single like guiding principle. I think we have a mantra that we picked up in some of our benchmarking, which is think big, start small, but start. And so kind of think about what you might be able to accomplish, but don't be paralyzed by that, and get a small start and do that agile cycles. And lastly, celebrate your own successes, right? Know what success looks like. Don't count on others to do it for you. As a matter of fact, I mentioned some of the partner organizations could even see a KM program as a threat, or that they already checked that box of knowledge management. But really understanding how other people have benefited through communities, lessons, taxonomies, what have you, and seeing the value that you bring the organization. We document our success stories, we share them with senior leaders, and that not just gives us energy back, it reinforces the people using it, and it reinforces our legitimacy. So again, celebrate your success and enjoy it.
I love it. And those seem like very achievable goals. Everybody can start by doing something today.
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely. Everyone manages knowledge.
That's right. Now just remember to make it part of your practice.
Exactly.
Excellent. Well, Marty, I thank you so much for spending some time here with us today and really giving us a much better understanding of this topic. We look forward to connecting with you again in the near future as you complete some of your research.
Fantastic. Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it very much. So thank you.
Absolutely. Of course. I also want to say a big thank you to Ben Kitchen, our producer, and the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. Lastly, a big shout out to you, our valued listeners. If you have topic requests or guest suggestions, we'd love to hear from you about that. And if you've enjoyed this episode, we ask you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice, and remember to share it with your friends, colleagues, and online networks. That helps us grow and get all of this great information out to you and your colleagues. For today's show notes and information on this podcast, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. And we'll be back again next week with another great interview. Until then, stay healthy and safe.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.
IVT's Validation Week is going virtual for 2020 this October. Not to be confused with a single presentation, webinar, or Zoom training, Val Week 2020 brings a completely virtual 3-day conference experience. With nearly 30 expert speakers and a combination of live and on-demand sessions crafted with your time in mind, the caliber of training content is unrivaled. Hear from top pharma, biotech, and medical device subject matter experts, gain exclusive insights from FDA speakers, build up your team's validation toolkit with take-home checklists and materials, and leverage unlimited networking opportunities with colleagues and key decision makers. Plus, claim up to 15 credit hours toward GMP training requirements. You won't want to miss it. Visit www.informaconnect.com/validation week for all details on agenda and registration. Once again, that's www.informaconnect.com/validation-week for all event details.